Welcome to Canadian News Chronicle, your front row seat to the pulse of Canada. From Parliament Hill to prairie towns, we break down the latest in politics, crime, the economy, housing, and everything in between. No spin, no fluff, just the facts that matter to Canadians. This is Episode 3, Canada's Fentanyl Crisis, Tariffs, and Sovereign Accountability. Let's dive in. Welcome to a vital discussion that demands our unwavering attention. Today, we confront a profound challenge, one that strikes at the very foundations of our society and reverberates across the North American continent. We are here to dissect Canada's fentanyl crisis, tariffs, and sovereign accountability. This is not merely a segment of the daily news cycle. It is an unfolding tragedy, a stark reflection of systemic failures and a perilous erosion of national sovereignty. The sheer scale of suffering, the relentless march of death, demands that we look unflinchingly at the uncomfortable truths. We must understand how this crisis, born of human frailty and institutional neglect, has metastasized into a transnational threat. Our discussion today will be deeply analytical, pulling back the layers of comfortable narratives to reveal the stark, uncomfortable reality beneath. We will proceed methodically, as any serious inquiry into such complex pathologies requires. We begin with the grim statistics, the undeniable markers of this catastrophe. Since 2016, Canada has recorded over 40,000 opioid-related deaths. In 2022 alone, an average of 21 deaths were reported each day to opioid-related overdoses. This is a public health crisis of monumental proportions, deeply intertwined with a toxic illegal drug supply. Fentanyl, a potent synthetic opioid, is the primary driver of these overdose deaths. It is often mixed with other dangerous substances like benzodiazepines and xylazine, complicating treatment and reducing the effectiveness of naloxone. This isn't merely about individual addiction. It's about a toxic and unpredictable illegal drug supply that permeates our communities. A supply where the dose and contents are unknown, turning every illicit consumption into a deadly gamble. How did a nation like Canada, perceived by many as a benign, peaceable entity, a land of beers and hockey, become a significant hub for global fentanyl trafficking? This is the core question we must address. For too long, the prevalent narrative has been one of blissful ignorance, a widespread underestimation of the cartel threat. Organized crime was traditionally viewed as a localized public safety issue, rather than the transnational finance and border security risk it clearly is. This profound conceptual error allowed the problem to fester, unaddressed and unseen, even as Canadian overdose deaths mounted. It took external pressure, notably from the U.S. government under the Trump administration, to finally force a reckoning. The announcement of 35% tariffs on Canadian imports, citing Canada's failure to meaningfully address the growing use of its territory by fentanyl traffickers, was a jarring signal that the status quo was no longer tenable. This wasn't an overreaction from the U.S. It was a reaction to a real and mounting problem, one that threatened to undermine the very fabric of North American trade and security. This external pressure, uncomfortable as it was, initiated belated government actions, including increased border security investments and the appointment of a fentanyl czar. The core issue here is sovereign accountability, the principle that nations must take responsibility for criminal activities originating within their borders that impact others. Canada found itself in the uncomfortable position of being held accountable for its structural vulnerabilities, a role once occupied by nations like Mexico and Venezuela. This serves as our critical context as we delve deeper into the specific mechanisms of this infiltration. The penetration of Mexican cartels into Canada is not a recent phenomenon, nor is it a random occurrence. It is the result of a calculated, strategic exploitation of Canada's structural vulnerabilities. We've been operating under the naive assumption that our northern expanse was somehow immune, a delusion that has proven deadly. Let us first consider our vast and largely unprotected border with the United States, stretching over 5,000 miles. This immense frontier offers countless unmonitored pathways for illicit transport. It's a stark contrast to the heightened security along the U.S. southern border. Traffickers leverage everything from light aircraft and 4x4 vehicles to simple cross-border walks. The crackdown on the U.S. southern border incentivized cartels to pivot north, recognizing Canada's less fortified corridor as an opportune new route. Crucially, the Port of Vancouver stands as a glaring vulnerability. This strategic Pacific coast entry point is a conduit for precursor chemicals, primarily from China, essential for fentanyl production. The most astonishing and damning fact here is the minimal inspection rate. Less than 1% of all incoming cargo is searched. This abject lack of oversight creates a wide-open door for massive quantities of unmonitored goods. The implications are clear. Without diligence, corruption thrives. Reports suggest that even longshoremen at the port may be compromised, either on organized crime payrolls or coerced into turning a blind eye. We are looking at a system seemingly designed for exploitation. Mexican cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, CJNG, have demonstrated remarkable entrepreneurial acumen and strategic foresight. They have not simply transplanted their operations. They have strategically aligned with established Canadian organized crime groups. Groups such as the Hells Angels, Brothers Keepers, Red Scorpion, and the United Nations Gang provide cartels with ready-made infrastructure, distribution networks, and localized expertise. These pre-existing domestic networks facilitate everything from fentanyl production to its subsequent distribution, even into the U.S. Indeed, cartels have been operating in Canada, moving their illicit trade, for at least the past decade, gaining a foothold with Mexican cartel operatives moving into Canada from around 2016. Fentanyl superlabs have been discovered in British Columbia, equipped with specialized chemical processing equipment, reflecting sophisticated operations tied to these transnational networks. Furthermore, cartels actively recruit Canadian nationals. Individuals with violent backgrounds, ex-boxers, or those seeking financial opportunity in a struggling economy are prime targets, serving as enforcers, hitmen, and logistical managers for illicit businesses. This recruitment extends to social media, with fake postings on platforms like Facebook and TikTok luring vulnerable young people with the promise of easy money and a luxurious lifestyle, a deeply insidious form of propaganda. Direct offers of $55,000 to take out hits in Canada, with specific instructions for obtaining weapons and avoiding collateral damage, demonstrate the concrete nature of these recruitment efforts. We also cannot overlook the flow of illegal firearms. The ease of straw buying and smuggling of American-manufactured firearms from the U.S. into Canada arms these Canadian organized crime groups, enabling their violent operations and solidifying their partnerships with international cartels. A significant percentage, over 70%, of firearms found at Mexican crime scenes are American-made. This unchecked flow of weaponry provides the means for cartels and their Canadian affiliates to enforce their will with brutal efficiency. What is perhaps most unsettling is the anonymity and impunity with which these cartels operate in Canada. Canadian authorities do not publicly track which specific criminal organizations are linked to which labs or trafficking operations. Police investigations and press releases often only refer to Mexican associates, allowing cartels to flourish entirely under the radar. This absence of precise identification means that the full scope of the cartel presence is often obscured, preventing a comprehensive, targeted response. The entanglement of Canada in the global fentanyl trade has profound implications for North American trade relations, especially with the United States. The Trump administration's decision to levy 35% tariffs on Canadian imports was a pivotal moment. It was a forceful declaration that Canada's perceived inaction directly threatened American lives and national security. This was not a mere trade dispute. It was a demand for sovereign accountability. The U.S. explicitly stated that these tariffs were a response to Canada's continued failure to arrest traffickers, seize illicit drugs, or coordinate with U.S. law enforcement regarding fentanyl trafficking. The argument was clear. The fentanyl seized from Canada, despite being a smaller volume compared to the southern border, carried immense potency, enough to kill millions of Americans. This put Canada in the same pressure chamber as Mexico. Mexico had faced similar fentanyl-linked tariffs. This strong-arm tactic, while criticized by some, exposed a critical vulnerability in the CUSMA trade agreement. The success of this economic partnership hinges on each signatory's ability to mitigate threats to trade. When transnational criminal organizations exploit one partner's weaknesses, it inevitably affects the others. The Mexican transnational criminal organizations, through their control of drug, precursor, and human smuggling, are now capable of impairing legitimate trade movements. Their imposition of quotas or criminal taxation fees on Mexican exporters of avocados and limes, for instance, highlights how illicit activities directly impact legal commerce, even reaching American markets. The structural nature of Canada's vulnerabilities has made it particularly susceptible. Regulatory blind spots, fragmented enforcement, and opaque corporate formation laws have historically allowed criminal networks to exploit the system. This is particularly evident in the rampant money laundering through real estate and trade-based schemes, where bribery and corruption pose significant risks. Major Canadian financial institutions have been penalized for anti-money laundering failures. TD Bank admitted to processing over $650 million in suspected fentanyl proceeds. These deep structural gaps persisted until the failures became too large to ignore, demonstrating a profound lack of oversight and integrity within Canada's financial safeguards. The tariffs served as a stark reminder that drug routes are no longer solely a law enforcement issue. They are a matter of sovereign accountability addressed through economic leverage. The intention was not to cripple Canada's economy, but to compel action against its vulnerabilities. If these remain unaddressed, the economic impact could be severe: expanded trade penalties, de-risking by correspondent banks, hesitating investment flows, and ultimately, an erosion of trust, financial, diplomatic, and regulatory. This is the cold, hard logic of geopolitical reality. The operational landscape in Canada, as described by those on the front lines, reveals a deeply troubling picture. Canadian law enforcement's approach to fentanyl trafficking has been reactive, fragmented, and severely under-resourced. Officials within law enforcement openly acknowledge their lack of adequate resources and capabilities to combat transnational organized crime effectively. This isn't merely a matter of budget shortfalls. It points to a deeper systemic dysfunction. A critical issue lies in the disconnect in intelligence gathering. For instance, the head of the RCMP estimated 4,000 organized crime groups operating in Canada, a dramatically higher figure than the 668 identified by Canada's intelligence agency. Such a profound discrepancy indicates a fundamental failure to accurately assess the scope of the problem, making any coherent national strategy virtually impossible. Furthermore, Canadian authorities do not publicly track which criminal organizations are linked to which labs or trafficking operations. This operational opacity allows cartels to maintain a chilling degree of anonymity, operating without the public scrutiny that might otherwise spur more decisive action. For many years, Canada's stance on organized crime was characterized by a historical underestimation. It was seen as a localized issue, a public safety concern, rather than the transnational threat to finance and border security it truly represents. The pervasive, almost quaint, perception of Canada as a benign nation contributed to a widespread underestimation of the cartel threat. This naive view prevented proactive engagement, and significant government actions, such as appointing a fentanyl czar and increasing border security investments, were largely reactive measures taken only in response to pressure and tariff threats from the U.S. government. These actions were not a genuine, proactive response to the escalating number of Canadian overdose deaths. The Canadian legal system itself appears to be part of the problem. There is a profound lack of justice in Canada, with perpetrators of violent crimes often receiving lenient sentences. These individuals quickly re-enter the community. This leniency, coupled with the lack of resources for comprehensive law enforcement, inadvertently creates an environment ripe for criminal exploitation. The legal framework becomes a weakness that criminal enterprises exploit. The result of these policy and enforcement challenges is a system that allows cartels to thrive. They operate their illicit networks like a Fortune 500 company, demonstrating shrewd adaptability and strategic thinking. When one avenue is closed, they swiftly find another. This dynamic makes traditional, reactive law enforcement tactics largely ineffective against such agile and well-funded adversaries. The country's own internal limitations and conceptual misunderstandings of the threat have inadvertently facilitated its rise as a global drug hub. The fentanyl crisis is not merely a Canadian problem. It is a North American challenge that inextricably links Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, CUSMA, highlights a complex web of interdependence where issues in one nation inevitably impact the others. The U.S. approach of nation-level accountability through economic tools like tariffs and sanctions signifies a fundamental shift in strategy. Drug routes are no longer just law enforcement issues. They are sovereign responsibilities. Mexico, too, finds itself in this complex web. Its government faces immense challenges with cartel infiltration at all levels, from local law enforcement and the National Guard to political figures. Mexican presidents, including the current one, Claudia Sheinbaum, have been criticized for policies that appear to enable cartel operations. AMLO's hugs not bullets approach and the limiting of U.S. law enforcement activities in Mexico create an environment where impunity and corruption flourish, further destabilizing the region and the entire North American trade ecosystem. When Mexican officials with narco ties are defended by the government, it undermines the very trust necessary for effective international cooperation. The U.S. perceives Mexico as the weakest link among the CUSMA members. Cartels increasingly affect and even dictate the pace and volume of legitimate trade. This evolving threat poses severe risks to U.S. national security, impacting public safety through drug deaths, increasing commerce costs, and straining the CUSMA relationship. The ultimate fear is a narco-democracy in Mexico, which could precipitate U.S. military intervention, an outcome neither side desires. Despite these grave concerns, bilateral cooperation does exist, albeit with inherent limitations. U.S. agencies like ICE and HSI work with Mexican forces to identify precursor shipments and dismantle labs, sometimes leading to visible joint operations. However, a fundamental tension remains. The U.S. holds back certain intelligence. It cannot remain isolated from these dynamics. Its vulnerabilities, particularly open borders and lax oversight, make it attractive to cartels seeking to avoid U.S. pressure. The U.S. expects Canada to take a stronger stance. Canada must address its internal weaknesses and cooperate fully in stemming the flow of illicit substances. Without genuine commitment from all parties, trade agreements, security partnerships, and North American stability face escalating threats. The pressure from the U.S. on Canada was not arbitrary. It was a consequence of a profound geopolitical reality that Canada, for too long, chose to ignore. Now, we turn to the path forward, a daunting prospect requiring more than policy changes. It demands a fundamental shift in mindset. The solutions are not simple. There is no single silver bullet for such a multifaceted problem. Firstly, Canada must close its anti-money laundering loopholes. The financial infrastructure that enables vast sums of illicit proceeds to flow through the country must be rigorously reformed. This requires cracking down on shell entities and reevaluating how financial institutions police themselves. Previous failures were symptomatic of a deeper underappreciated risk in the sector. This is not merely about penalties. It's about restoring integrity to the financial system and making it inhospitable to criminal wealth. Secondly, Canadian law enforcement needs cohesive data gathering and resource allocation. The disconnect between differing estimates of organized crime groups must be rectified immediately to enable a unified understanding of the threat. Resources must be allocated proactively to combat transnational organized crime, moving beyond the historical treatment of these as localized public safety issues. This necessitates a serious national strategy that delivers results. Thirdly, we must acknowledge the adaptive nature of these criminal enterprises. Cartels are run like Fortune 500 companies, constantly responding to market demand and shifting tactics. Legalizing drugs will not eliminate the black market. It will simply shift focus to other illicit substances or revenue streams. The issue is deeper than legality. It is about human demand, driven by addiction, desperation, and the pursuit of perceived power or wealth. Addressing the demand side requires a compassionate yet realistic approach to addiction as a public health crisis, recognizing its deep societal roots. From an international perspective, Canada and the U.S. must jointly pressure Mexico. They must insist Mexico strengthen its judiciary and rule of law, reversing policies that shield cartels and limit law enforcement cooperation. A narco-democracy in Mexico would devastate North American relations and fracture trade agreements. Looking to the future, the outlook is sobering. Cartels are not static. They are exploring new production methods, teaching chemistry students to produce precursors from scratch to cut out China as a middleman. They are diversifying revenue streams beyond drugs and human smuggling into crude oil theft and agriculture, generating billions and intertwining with legitimate economies. They control water and Wi-Fi in certain Mexican towns. This demonstrates an alarming reach into daily life. Their use of propaganda via social media, music, and influencers is a sophisticated recruitment tool, presenting a seductive, false narrative of luxury and power to vulnerable youth. This psychological warfare demands a counter-narrative that exposes the brutal reality behind the glamour. The U.S. understands that a full-fledged offensive against cartels would be extremely bloody. The current strategy focuses on attacking financial pipelines and assets within the U.S., cutting off the money that fuels these organizations. This is complemented by intelligence gathering and bilateral operations. Yet the fundamental power imbalance between state forces and these highly organized, well-armed, and deeply entrenched criminal networks remains. The critical takeaway is this: the vulnerabilities in Canada are structural and deeply ingrained. Overcoming them requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It demands a move from reactive complacency to proactive, coordinated action, both domestically and internationally. If Canada fails to solidify its enforcement credibility and enact a serious national strategy, the economic and human costs will continue to mount, leading to a deeper unraveling of societal order. Fentanyl isn't waiting, and neither are the traffickers. It is time for Canada to get its house in order. Thanks for listening to Canadian Chronicle, where we decode the headlines shaping Canada's future. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who cares about Canada as much as you do. Follow the show on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, and leave a rating or comment to let us know what you think. Stay curious, stay informed, and until next time, keep questioning.